When the rich rancher noticed bruises on his black wife, he set in motion events that would shatter his entire town. "Where did these come from?" the mountain man demands, his calloused fingers tracing purple marks on the trembling girl's arms. The townspeople see her as nothing more than a curiosity, an educated black woman who married above her station, destined to be broken by forces beyond her control. They whisper she'll be discarded within the year, another casualty of crossing social boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But the mountain man sees something different in his wife's eyes. Not fear, but fierce determination hiding dangerous secrets. Her bruises aren't what they appear to be, and the truth she's concealing could expose corruption reaching into every powerful family in town. Will her hidden mission destroy them both, or transform their community forever? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Dusty Hollow's main street as Evangeline Cross stepped through the general store's wooden doors. The brass bell above announced her arrival with a sharp clang that seemed to echo louder than usual. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed her every movement. She wore a simple blue dress that spoke of quality rather than flash. Her posture remained straight despite the weight of stares pressing down on her shoulders. The storekeeper, Mr. Hutchins, continued sorting through his ledger without looking up. "Flour, sugar, and coffee beans," Evangeline said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of formal education. Hutchins finally raised his eyes. His movements were deliberate as he gathered the items, each action designed to communicate reluctance. Behind her, whispers began like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Don't know why Magnus allows such independence," came a woman's voice. "Some folks forget their place quick enough," another added. Sheriff Coleman Briggs filled the doorway, his badge catching the afternoon light. His presence made the whispers grow bolder. He nodded to the other customers while his eyes remained fixed on Evangeline's back. Dr. Miriam Hayes entered quietly through the side door that connected to her medical practice. She observed the tension with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed too many such scenes. Her gaze met Evangeline's briefly, offering the smallest nod of acknowledgement. "That'll be $3, Hutchins announced, his tone suggesting the price might be negotiable for other customers. Evangeline counted out exact change. No arguments, no complaints. She gathered her purchases and moved toward the door with measured steps. Sheriff Briggs stepped aside just enough to let her pass. "Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice carrying authority that demanded acknowledgement. "Sheriff," she replied without breaking stride. The late afternoon heat wrapped around her as she loaded supplies into her wagon. The brown mare stamped impatiently, sensing her rider's eagerness to leave. Evangeline climbed onto the driver's seat and guided the horse toward the edge of town. The Cross Ranch sprawled across the horizon like a small kingdom. Cattle dotted the landscape in organized clusters. The main house stood 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work and smart decisions. Magnus Cross emerged from the barn as his wife approached. Dust covered his clothes and hands, evidence of another day spent working alongside his men rather than merely directing them. His weathered face softened when he saw her. "How was town?" he asked, taking the reins as she climbed down. "The usual," Evangeline replied, but something in her voice made him study her more carefully. That evening, Magnus noticed the purple marks on her arms as she reached for the serving bowl during dinner. The bruises were fresh, dark, unmistakable. What happened? The question came out sharper than he intended. Evangeline's hand moved instinctively to cover the marks. "Kitchen accident. The stove door caught my arm." Magnus knew every inch of their kitchen. The explanation didn't match the pattern of bruises he saw. His jaw tightened as possibilities raced through his mind. Had one of the ranch hands crossed a line? Had someone in town grown bold enough to lay hands on his wife? "Which door?" he pressed. "The large one. I was distracted while baking." Her eyes remained fixed on her plate. Magnus had built his fortune by reading people and situations. His wife was lying. The question was why? Over the following days, he watched her more carefully. Evangeline left the ranch at unusual hours. She claimed visits to Dr. Hayes for women's health matters, but the timing seemed odd. Sometimes she returned with grass stains on her dress or mud on her boots, despite taking the main roads. Meanwhile, in town, Judge Silas Crenshaw held court in the cramped building that served as courthouse and town hall. A woman with a swollen eye stood before his bench, her husband beside her with arms crossed. "Domestic disputes are family matters," the judge declared without looking up from his papers. "Work it out at home." The woman's shoulders sagged. Her husband's satisfied smirk spoke volumes about how such matters would be resolved. Sheriff Briggs escorted the couple outside, his hand firm on the woman's elbow. "Best to keep family business private," he advised in a tone that carried clear warning. Evangeline watched from across the street, her hands gripping her market basket until her knuckles went white. The woman's defeated expression burned into her memory like a brand. That afternoon brought more bruises. Magnus discovered them when Evangeline winced while lifting a water pitcher. These were on her shoulder, finger-shaped marks that spoke of someone grabbing her roughly. "Evangeline," his voice carried the authority that commanded respect from cattle buyers and ranch hands alike. "Tell me what's really happening." She met his eyes for the first time in days. Behind her careful composure, he glimpsed something that surprised him. Not fear, not shame, determination mixed with fierce protectiveness. "Some truths are dangerous, Magnus," she said quietly, "even for men like you." The words hung between them like a challenge. Magnus realized his wife wasn't a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was actively involved in something that put her in harm's way, something she considered more important than her own safety. "Dangerous to whom?" he asked. Evangeline's silence stretched long enough to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance, normal ranch sounds that suddenly felt fragile. "To everyone," she finally whispered. Magnus set down his coffee cup with deliberate control. The morning light streaming through their kitchen window illuminated the fresh bruise on Evangeline's wrist. His patience had reached its limit. "No more lies," he said. "Tell me who's hurting you." Evangeline studied her husband's face. 3 years of marriage had taught her to read his expressions. This wasn't anger born of suspicion. This was protective fury barely held in check. "I'm helping women escape dangerous situations," she said quietly. "The bruises come from that work." Magnus blinked. Of all the explanations he'd considered, this wasn't among them. "What women?" Evangeline rose from the table and walked to their back door. She gestured toward the barn. "Come with me." They crossed the yard in silence. Magnus noted details he'd missed before. Fresh hay scattered near the barn's side entrance, water buckets in places where no livestock grazed, blankets hanging on lines that shouldn't need washing. Inside the barn, Evangeline led him past the horse stalls to a section he rarely visited. Behind stacks of feed sacks, a narrow door opened into what had been a storage room. Now it held 3 cots, a small table, and supplies that spoke of human habitation. "Sheriff Briggs beats his wife," Evangeline explained. "Has for years. When she finally decided to leave, she had nowhere to go." Magnus absorbed this information like a physical blow. Coleman Briggs represented law and order in Dusty Hollow. The man who arrested troublemakers and kept the peace was creating victims in his own home. "She's here now?" "She was. I helped her reach her sister in Tucson." Evangeline touched her shoulder where the finger-shaped bruises had formed. Coleman didn't appreciate losing his target. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Magnus's wife hadn't been victimized by unknown assailants. She'd been fighting back against the town's most powerful law enforcement officer. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months since I started helping women directly." Evangeline opened a wooden crate tucked beneath one of the cots. Inside, folders contained handwritten pages covered in neat script. "But I've been documenting cases for over a year." Magnus lifted one folder. The contents made his stomach turn. Detailed accounts of beatings, threats, and systematic abuse. Medical observations written in precise language. Dates, times, and witness statements organized with methodical care. Where did you learn to do this? My father worked as a court clerk in Alabama before the war, Evangeline said. He taught enslaved people how to navigate legal systems when possible. He showed me how documentation could protect people when nothing else would. Magnus flipped through more pages. Each case was meticulously recorded, each woman's story preserved with dignity and legal precision. And after the war, I taught at a freedmen's school in Georgia. We helped families reunite, taught literacy, and documented crimes against our students. Her voice carried the weight of experience earned through hardship. Violence thrives in darkness. Light is our best weapon. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Miriam Hayes peered around the barn door, medical bag in hand. I saw you both come out here, she said. Thought it might be time. Magnus looked between his wife and the doctor. Time for what? Dr. Hayes set her bag on the small table. For you to understand what we're really dealing with. She opened the bag and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with papers. I've been treating victims of domestic violence for 5 years. Broken bones, burns, cuts that needed stitches, all explained away as kitchen accidents or falls downstairs. The doctor spread photographs across the table, medical documentation of injuries too severe and patterned to be accidental. I took these pictures to preserve evidence, Dr. Hayes continued, but I had no one to give them to. Sheriff Briggs wouldn't investigate. Judge Crenshaw wouldn't prosecute. The system protected the abusers. Magnus studied the evidence with growing horror. How many women? At least 24 with serious injuries, probably twice that many who never sought medical help. Dr. Hayes's professional composure couldn't hide her frustration. I became a doctor to heal people. Instead, I was documenting crimes no one would address. Evangeline pulled out another folder, until we decided to address them ourselves. The pages contained correspondence with territorial authorities, letters to women's organizations in California and Colorado, copies of legal precedents from other jurisdictions where domestic violence cases had been successfully prosecuted. You've been building a legal case, Magnus realized. We've been building a movement, Evangeline corrected. Individual rescues help one woman at a time. Systematic change helps everyone. Dr. Hayes nodded toward the medical evidence. Evangeline understood that scattered good deeds wouldn't solve the problem. We needed documentation strong enough to force institutional change. Magnus felt his worldview reshaping itself around this new reality. His wife wasn't a victim needing protection. She was a strategist conducting a careful campaign against entrenched corruption. What do you need from me? Resources, Evangeline said immediately. Safe houses, transportation, legal support when we're ready to present our case. And social standing, Dr. Hayes added. People who won't listen to a black woman or a female doctor might hear Magnus cross. Magnus looked around the hidden room that had sheltered desperate women. His wife had risked everything to provide refuge for people society had abandoned. She'd turned their barn into a sanctuary and their ranch into the first stop on an underground railroad for the abused. What are we up against? Evangeline's expression hardened. Sheriff Briggs is just the beginning. Judge Crenshaw dismisses cases to protect the town's reputation. Mayor Thompson knows what's happening and chooses silence. This goes all the way to the top. The magnitude of the conspiracy settled over Magnus like a heavy blanket. His wife had declared war on Dusty Hollow's entire power structure. She was using intelligence, documentation, and legal strategy to topple men who considered themselves untouchable. When do we start? 2 weeks later, Magnus hosted his monthly cattle buyers' dinner. The dining room filled with Dusty Hollow's most prominent men and their wives. Crystal glasses caught lamplight as conversations flowed over prime beef and imported wine. Evangeline moved between guests with practiced grace, refilling glasses and offering polite conversation. To the men, she was background decoration. To their wives, she was an opportunity. Mrs. Henderson, Evangeline said quietly to the banker's wife, might I show you the rose garden? The evening air would be refreshing. Once outside, away from listening ears, Evangeline's tone shifted. How are you healing? Mrs. Henderson's hand moved instinctively to her ribs, where bruises had faded to yellow. Better, thanks to Dr. Hayes's ointment. Has he noticed the medical visits? He thinks I'm treating female complaints. The woman's voice carried bitter irony. He doesn't ask questions about women's medicine. Evangeline guided her to a stone bench surrounded by climbing roses. Would you be willing to document what happened? For legal purposes? Mrs. Henderson's composure cracked. You don't understand what you're asking. My husband controls everything. The bank, the house, my children's futures. Documentation protects you. Without records, it's your word against his. Evangeline's voice remained gentle but firm. With proper evidence, territorial authorities must act. Inside, Magnus engaged Judge Crenshaw in conversation about territorial law. The judge's comfort with expensive whiskey made him talkative about legal precedents and jurisdictional boundaries. Domestic matters rarely reach territorial courts, Crenshaw explained, swirling his drink. Local communities handle such issues more efficiently. Efficiently for whom? Magnus asked. For everyone involved. Public trials create unnecessary scandal. Better to resolve matters privately. Magnus filed away this admission. The judge had just confirmed his policy of protecting reputations over victims. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes made her evening rounds. 3 women waited in her clinic after official hours. Each carried injuries that told familiar stories. Sarah Mitchell clutched her infant son while Dr. Hayes examined finger-shaped bruises around her throat. The young mother had married the blacksmith 6 months earlier. The bruises had appeared within weeks of the wedding. He says I'm clumsy, Sarah whispered. Maybe I am. Clumsiness doesn't leave handprints, Dr. Hayes replied while documenting the injury patterns. This is evidence of assault. In another room, elderly Mrs. Foster rolled up her sleeves to reveal burn marks from a poker iron. Her son controlled her late husband's estate and used physical intimidation to prevent her from seeking legal counsel about her inheritance. He's family, she protested weakly. Family doesn't hurt family. Family especially shouldn't hurt family, Dr. Hayes countered, while photographing the evidence. The third woman needed no encouragement to speak. Rebecca Torres had escaped her husband's violence by claiming she was visiting relatives in Mexico. Instead, she'd hidden in the cross barn for 3 days while planning her next move. I want him stopped, she declared. Not just for me. He's already eyeing our daughter the wrong way. Dr. Hayes carefully documented each case while building trust with women who'd been taught to suffer in silence. She explained legal rights they didn't know they possessed and medical options that could preserve evidence of abuse. Back at the dinner party, conversations grew more revealing as alcohol loosened tongues. Mayor Thompson boasted about keeping Dusty Hollow's reputation clean by discouraging troublemakers from filing complaints with territorial authorities. Bad publicity drives away investors, he explained to nods of approval from other businessmen. Sometimes local solutions serve everyone better. Evangeline collected these admissions like a prospector gathering gold nuggets. Each careless comment added weight to the conspiracy case she was building. The evening's most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source. Judge Crenshaw's wife mentioned seeing several women visiting Dr. Hayes after regular hours. Probably female troubles, she confided to another woman, though some looked more injured than ill. Mrs. Crenshaw's observation confirmed what Evangeline suspected. Their rescue operation was becoming visible to people who might report suspicious activity to their husbands. After the guests departed, Magnus and Evangeline met with Dr. Hayes in the barn sanctuary. The evening's intelligence painted a disturbing picture of coordinated suppression. They know, Dr. Hayes said bluntly. Not the details, but they sense something's changing. Evangeline spread out territorial maps marked with safe houses, escape routes, and potential allies in neighboring towns. Then we accelerate the timeline. How? Magnus asked. Territorial court session is in 6 weeks. Judge Morrison comes from Tucson to hear cases local courts can't handle. Evangeline pointed to documents outlining legal procedures. If we present him with enough evidence, he'll have to act. Dr. Hayes opened her medical portfolio. I have documented cases on 15 women spanning 3 years, photographs, written testimonies, injury patterns that prove systematic abuse. Magnus studied the evidence with growing determination. What do you need from me? Transportation for women who want to testify, financial support for those who will lose everything when they speak out, and protection when Sheriff Briggs realizes what we're doing. The magnitude of their undertaking settled over them like evening shadows. They were preparing to challenge every power structure in Dusty Hollow simultaneously. Success meant justice for dozens of women. Failure meant destruction for everyone involved. Sheriff Briggs won't wait for territorial court, Dr. Hayes warned. Once he understands the scope of our evidence, he'll act to protect himself. Evangeline's expression hardened with resolve. Then we better be ready for him. Sheriff Briggs arrived at the Cross Ranch 3 days before the territorial court session. His badge glinted in the morning sun as he rode up the main drive with 2 deputies flanking him. Magnus emerged from the house to meet them on the front porch. Coleman. Magnus nodded, his tone carefully neutral. Magnus, need to speak with your wife about some missing persons reports. Briggs dismounted with deliberate slowness. Several women have disappeared from town recently. Disappeared or left abusive situations? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. That's an interesting distinction. Evangeline appeared in the doorway, her posture straight and unintimidated despite facing 3 armed men. Sheriff, what can I help you with? Where's my wife, Mrs. Cross? I wouldn't know. I'm not my sister's keeper. Briggs stepped closer to the porch. Funny thing about missing persons. They tend to leave trails that lead here. Magnus moved protectively beside his wife. Are you making accusations or asking questions? I'm conducting an investigation into criminal harboring of runaway wives. The sheriff's hand rested casually on his gun belt. Interfering with lawful marriages is a serious offense. Dr. Hayes's buggy appeared on the horizon, approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a social call. She pulled up beside the sheriff's horses and climbed down with her medical bag. Gentlemen, she said crisply, I hope I'm not interrupting official business. Just community discussion, Briggs replied, his attention now divided between 3 potential threats. Excellent. Then you'll want to hear about my medical findings regarding domestic violence in our community. Dr. Hayes opened her bag and withdrew a thick portfolio. I've documented systematic patterns of abuse spanning multiple years. The sheriff's casual demeanor evaporated. Medical records are confidential. Medical records of criminal assault become evidence. Dr. Hayes's voice carried the authority of professional expertise, especially when local law enforcement fails to investigate reported crimes. Magnus watched the confrontation with growing understanding. This wasn't a fishing expedition. Briggs knew exactly what they'd been doing and had come to shut down their operation before territorial authorities arrived. I could arrest all 3 of you right now, the sheriff said. On what charges? Evangeline stepped forward, her education evident in the legal precision of her question. Providing medical care to injured women? Offering shelter to people in danger? Documenting crimes you refuse to investigate? Dr. Hayes spread photographs across her buggy's seat. Medical evidence of injuries too severe and patterned to be accidents. These are your handiwork, Coleman, and the handiwork of men you've protected. The sheriff's face flushed red. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can. Evangeline produced a leather satchel from inside the house. Documented testimony from 15 women. Medical evidence spanning 3 years. Correspondence showing your pattern of dismissing legitimate complaints. Briggs lunged toward the porch, but Magnus blocked his path. The 2 men faced each other with decades of frontier tension crackling between them. Stand aside, Magnus. This doesn't concern you. My wife's safety concerns me greatly. The standoff stretched taut until Dr. Hayes cleared her throat. Perhaps we should discuss this matter at tonight's town meeting. Briggs spun toward her. What meeting? The one Judge Morrison requested when he arrived this morning, she replied smoothly. He's reviewing our evidence and wants to hear from the community before tomorrow's territorial court session. The sheriff's confident aggression crumbled into desperate calculation. Morrison's here already? With 2 territorial marshals and a court stenographer, Evangeline confirmed. They're setting up in the town hall as we speak. The trap had been sprung with precise timing. While Briggs focused on intimidating the Cross family, territorial authorities had quietly arrived to review evidence and interview witnesses. The sheriff's window for suppressing their investigation had closed. "You don't understand what you've done," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This town has order, peace. You're destroying everything. We're replacing your version of peace with actual justice," Magnus replied. Dr. Hayes packed her portfolio with practiced efficiency. "Coleman, I suggest you spend the afternoon consulting with legal counsel. Judge Morrison will want explanations for your failure to investigate multiple assault cases." The sheriff remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. His deputies exchanged uncertain glances as they followed him back toward town. The comfortable world where their authority went unquestioned was dissolving around them. "Will he try something desperate?" Magnus asked as the lawmen disappeared down the road. "Desperate men make mistakes," Evangeline replied. "Mistakes create more evidence." That afternoon, word spread through Dusty Hollow like wildfire. Territorial authorities were interviewing victims of domestic violence. Women who'd suffered in silence for years were finally being heard by officials with power to act. Judge Morrison set up court in the town hall with methodical precision. His stenographer documented every testimony while territorial marshals provided security for witnesses who'd never felt safe speaking publicly before. Sarah Mitchell testified about her husband's escalating violence. Rebecca Torres described years of systematic abuse and threats against her daughter. Mrs. Henderson revealed how her husband used financial control to enable physical intimidation. Each testimony added weight to the conspiracy case against local authorities who'd enabled abuse through willful neglect. Mayor Thompson arrived at the hall with Judge Crenshaw and several prominent businessmen. They expected to control the narrative through political influence and economic pressure. Instead, they found a federal judge reviewing documented evidence of systematic corruption. Their comfortable assumption that local problems stayed local had been shattered by women who refused to remain silent. "This is highly irregular," Mayor Thompson protested to Judge Morrison. "These are private family matters." "Assault is never a private matter," Morrison replied without looking up from the medical photographs. "It's a crime that demands prosecution regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim." The power structure that had protected abusers for years was crumbling under the weight of evidence they'd assumed would never be gathered, organized, and presented to authorities capable of acting on it. The territorial court session began at 8 o'clock sharp the following morning. Judge Morrison presided from behind a makeshift bench constructed from the town hall's lectern. His gavel struck wood with the authority of federal law. Sheriff Briggs sat in the front row, flanked by a hastily hired lawyer from Tucson. His uniform looked crisp, but sweat stains betrayed his nervousness. Judge Crenshaw occupied the seat beside him, his usual confidence replaced by worried fidgeting. Evangeline took the witness stand first. Her testimony laid the foundation for everything that followed. She spoke with the measured precision of an educator, transforming months of dangerous rescue work into legal evidence. "I documented 15 cases of systematic domestic violence," she stated clearly. "In each instance, local authorities either dismissed complaints or failed to investigate reported crimes." Judge Morrison studied the portfolio she'd prepared. Handwritten testimonies, medical documentation, photographs of injuries, letters to territorial authorities that had never received responses. "Mrs. Cross, what qualified you to conduct these investigations?" "My father taught court procedures to freed slaves in Alabama. I taught literacy and legal rights at a freedmen's school in Georgia. I understand how documentation protects people when institutions fail them." The judge's expression showed growing respect for the meticulous work before him. This wasn't the emotional outburst of an angry woman. This was systematic evidence gathering conducted with professional competence. Dr. Hayes testified next. Her medical expertise transformed individual injuries into patterns of criminal behavior. She presented photographs that made several spectators gasp in horror. "These injuries required immediate medical attention," she explained, pointing to documented burns and fractures. "Yet none were reported to law enforcement as assault cases." Magnus took the stand to describe the conspiracy of silence that protected abusers. His social standing gave weight to accusations that might have been dismissed from other witnesses. "Prominent men in this community use violence to control their families," he stated. "Local authorities enable this behavior by refusing to prosecute crimes committed behind closed doors." The most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. Sarah Mitchell described years of escalating violence that began within weeks of her marriage. Her quiet dignity as she recounted systematic abuse moved several spectators to tears. Rebecca Torres spoke with fierce determination about threats against her young daughter. Her willingness to risk everything to protect her child demonstrated the stakes involved. Mrs. Henderson's testimony revealed how financial control enabled physical abuse. Her husband's position as bank president had made her feel powerless to seek help through normal channels. Each woman who testified broke another link in the chain of silence that had protected their abusers for years. Sheriff Briggs's lawyer attempted damage control through procedural challenges. He questioned the admissibility of evidence gathered by civilians rather than trained investigators. Judge Morrison dismissed these objections with growing irritation. When local law enforcement fails to investigate crimes, citizens have both the right and responsibility to document evidence for higher authorities. The defense strategy crumbled when Dr. Hayes presented her complete medical files. 5 years of documented injuries. Patterns that proved systematic rather than isolated violence. Correspondence with territorial health authorities that local officials had ignored. Judge Crenshaw's testimony revealed the depth of institutional corruption. Under oath, he admitted dismissing domestic violence cases to preserve community harmony. "How does ignoring criminal assault preserve harmony?" Judge Morrison demanded. "Public trials create scandal that damages everyone involved," Crenshaw replied weakly, "including the perpetrators you're protecting from consequences." Mayor Thompson's testimony completed the picture of coordinated suppression. He confirmed policies designed to discourage complaints to territorial authorities. His justification centered on protecting Dusty Hollow's reputation rather than its residents. The evidence painted a clear picture. Local authorities had created a system where domestic violence flourished under official protection. Women suffered in silence while their abusers faced no consequences for criminal behavior. Judge Morrison announced his findings that afternoon. His voice carried the weight of federal authority as he addressed the packed courtroom. "This court finds credible evidence of systematic failure by local authorities to investigate and prosecute domestic violence crimes. Sheriff Coleman Briggs and Judge Silas Crenshaw are hereby removed from office pending territorial investigation." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Some spectators applauded, while others sat in stunned silence. The untouchable pillars of local authority had been toppled by women who refused to accept abuse as their natural fate. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "this court orders the establishment of victim support services and mandatory domestic violence prosecution policies. Mrs. Cross will serve as territorial advisor for implementation." Territorial marshals placed Briggs and Crenshaw under arrest for corruption and abuse of power. The men who had controlled Dusty Hollow's version of justice were led away in handcuffs. Dr. Hayes received official appointment as territorial health advisor for domestic violence cases. Her years of secret documentation would now serve as the foundation for regional policy reforms. Magnus found his business reputation enhanced rather than damaged by supporting justice over comfortable corruption. Cattle buyers and investors respected his moral courage. Progressive settlers sought out Dusty Hollow as a community that protected rather than exploited the vulnerable. The women who had testified discovered strength they hadn't known they possessed. Speaking publicly about their experiences created bonds of mutual support that extended far beyond the courtroom. Sarah Mitchell filed for divorce with territorial support for financial independence. Rebecca Torres gained legal protection for her daughter and herself. Mrs. Henderson reclaimed control of her inheritance with court backing. Their courage inspired other women throughout the territory to seek help for similar situations. Dusty Hollow became a symbol of what communities could achieve when justice replaced willful blindness. The transformation had begun with one woman's refusal to accept that systematic abuse was unchangeable. It reached fruition when an entire community chose truth over comfortable lies. Power structures built on silence and intimidation crumbled when confronted with documentation, courage, and legal authority willing to act on evidence rather than politics. 6 months after the territorial court session, Dusty Hollow bore little resemblance to its former self. The dusty main street remained unchanged, but the atmosphere transformed completely. Women walked with confidence that had been absent for years. Children played freely while their mothers conducted business without fear. The new sheriff, David Martinez, had arrived from Tucson with strict orders to enforce domestic violence laws, without regard to social status or family reputation. His first act was establishing a policy requiring investigation of all assault complaints, regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the renovated courthouse with efficiency that impressed even skeptics of territorial interference in local affairs. She processed divorce petitions, custody cases, and restraining orders with the understanding that legal protection served everyone's interests better than willful ignorance. The Dusty Hollow Women's Refuge occupied a converted mansion donated by Magnus Cross on the edge of town. Evangeline managed the facility with the systematic approach that had made her Underground Railroad successful. 20 beds provided temporary shelter, while permanent solutions were arranged through legal channels. Dr. Hayes ran medical services from an expanded clinic that treated injuries without requiring victims to fabricate explanations for suspicious wounds. Her documentation protocols had been adopted by territorial health authorities as the standard for domestic violence cases throughout Arizona. The refuge served women from across the territory. Stagecoaches arrived weekly with passengers seeking the safety and legal support that Dusty Hollow now represented. What had once been a community that silenced victims became a destination for women seeking justice. Evangeline's role as territorial advisor required monthly travel to Phoenix and Tucson for policy meetings. Her expertise in victim protection and evidence documentation shaped legislation that extended protections far beyond a single community. Magnus accompanied her on these trips, his business interests expanding as his reputation for ethical leadership attracted progressive investors. The Cross Ranch became headquarters for a cattle syndicate that prioritized fair labor practices and community development. Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than conventional marriage. Shared purpose created bonds that transcended social expectations about racial boundaries. They were equal allies in a mission that had transformed both their lives and their community. The old power structure had crumbled completely. Sheriff Briggs faced federal charges for corruption and abuse of power. Judge Crenshaw lost his law license and left the territory in disgrace. Mayor Thompson resigned under pressure from citizens who demanded accountability from their elected officials. New leadership emerged from unexpected sources. Sarah Mitchell, once the terrorized young mother, became the refugee's assistant director. Her experience with systematic abuse made her uniquely qualified to help other victims navigate legal and emotional recovery. Rebecca Torres opened a school that taught literacy and legal rights to women throughout the territory. Her classroom served as both educational facility and informal support network for mothers protecting their children from violent fathers. Mrs. Henderson used her reclaimed inheritance to fund legal aid services for women who couldn't afford attorney fees. Her financial resources enabled systematic challenges to laws that prevented women from escaping abusive marriages. The economic impact of these changes surprised even supporters of reform. Businesses thrived when half the population could participate openly in commerce rather than hiding from violent spouses. Investment flowed to communities that protected residents rather than exploiting them. Dusty Hollow's reputation spread throughout the Southwest. Newspapers carried stories about the small town that chose justice over comfortable corruption. The coverage attracted settlers who wanted to live in communities that protected the vulnerable rather than enabling their abuse. Churches found their attendance growing as families no longer feared public appearances that might trigger domestic violence. Social gatherings flourished when women could participate without calculating the cost of their husband's potential displeasure. Children grew up witnessing equality and justice as normal rather than exceptional. The next generation would inherit assumptions about human dignity that their parents had fought to establish against entrenched opposition. The territorial governor visited Dusty Hollow to study its transformation for potential replication in other communities. Evangeline presented him with detailed protocols for establishing victim support services and legal protections. "How did you convince an entire town to change?" he asked during the official reception. We didn't convince anyone, Evangeline replied. We documented the truth and presented it to authorities capable of acting on evidence rather than politics. Dr. Hayes added her perspective from years of treating victims in silence. Most people want to do right. They just need systems that reward justice rather than punishing truth. Magnus emphasized the economic benefits that followed social reform. Communities prosper when everyone can participate safely in civic and commercial life. The evening celebration filled the town hall with laughter and music that would have been impossible during the years of systematic oppression. Former victims danced with their children. New residents mingled with established families. The rigid social hierarchies that once defined Dusty Hollow had dissolved into fluid networks of mutual support. Evangeline stood on the same porch where Sheriff Briggs had once threatened her with arrest. The dusty street stretched before her, but the fear that once permeated the community had vanished. Women walked freely. Children played without worry. Men who had once ruled through intimidation had been replaced by leaders who served through competence and integrity. The transformation began with one woman's refusal to accept that systematic abuse was unchangeable. It succeeded because documentation, courage, and legal authority proved more powerful than intimidation, corruption, and willful silence. The trembling girl who had once hidden her activities from suspicious townspeople had become the immovable force that reshaped an entire community's understanding of justice, dignity, and human worth. Dusty Hollow had learned that protecting the vulnerable served everyone's interests better than enabling their exploitation. The lessons spread throughout the territory like seeds carried on desert winds, taking root wherever communities chose truth over comfortable lies.